So you've probably all heard by now that last week we reached an important milestone in our impacts on the biosphere and atmosphere. And for the first time in human existence, the atmosphere is at 400, or CO2 in the atmosphere is at 400 parts per million. So roughly 17% of global carbon emissions, though, are attributable to deforestation and forest degradation. And the majority of forest loss, as you probably also know, is taking place in the most biodiverse forests on the planet. These facts generate concern on many fronts, and researchers and policymakers have been struggling to address them for over 2 decades now. We recognize the need for policy to safeguard biodiversity and to limit CO2 emissions because of the work of many scientists who have been studying the causes and consequences of deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, even before there was momentum toward policy. Today, we're extremely fortunate to have 4 speakers here who can help us tie these ideas together and share insights on the demands and challenges that lie ahead. The title of this conference comes from the recognition that climate policy is innovating tactics to reduce CO2 emissions and increase carbon sequestration, while biodiversity conservation does not command the same global attention. This is likely due to a variety of reasons. Changes in the atmosphere will have measurable effects on us all, while the extinction, for example, of the Java rhino in Vietnam in 2011 may go largely unnoticed and unremarked upon. In addition, carbon markets create a financial incentive for conservation, which, idealism aside, is often what is required to effect widespread change. This next figure shows us locations around the world that contain a highly threatened species according to the IUCN Red List. The sites in yellow already have some degree of protection, but the majority of sites, those in red, are unprotected. And another thing you may notice is that the overwhelming majority of these sites are located in tropical regions. On this map, we see terrestrial carbon stocks, and it's easy to see that there's a large overlap in the regions then that require biodiversity conservation and offer opportunities for carbon sequestration and storage. So during the last 5 years, there's been a lot of positive, truly innovative policy creation to protect and increase forest carbon stocks. The concept of an international policy for reducing CO2 emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries was approved as the UN program in 2008. This was a great and highly innovative step forward for limiting atmospheric carbon. In addition, it was immediately recognized that increasing forest carbon stocks or preventing the release of carbon from forests without consideration of biodiversity could have severe unintended consequences. Later work on REDD therefore states that, quote, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries can promote co-benefits and may complement the aims and objectives of other relevant international conventions and agreements. These co-benefits can include the protection of biodiversity in forests that are being managed as carbon reserves. That's extremely important because even if you never personally experience the amphibians or plants that are going extinct, they're all interconnected parts of tightly functioning ecosystems with lengthy evolutionary histories. Biodiversity is key to ecosystem functioning, and beyond our quantification of its role or purpose, each species has an intrinsic right to its existence. REDD was then extended to REDD Plus in 2010 as a far-sighted movement toward a holistic policy to combine the needs to reduce atmospheric CO2 and to ensure the protection of biodiversity. We're therefore at a point at which we have both a scientific understanding of tropical forest biodiversity and its relationship to tropical forest functioning and stability. And we also have the policy tools to simultaneously address climate change and biodiversity conservation. Speaker of the day will be Dr. Val Kapos, the head of the Climate Change and Biodiversity Program of the United Nations Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. We're extremely lucky to have her here today to share her insights and expertise on the UN REDD Plus program. Dr. Kapos is deeply involved in policy and research, and she's worked on approaches to encourage multiple benefits from climate change mitigation policy. These additional benefits represent Dr. Kapos's concern for biodiversity conservation. She studies the development and use of biodiversity indicators, including spatial indicators derived from land cover data and indicators derived from national forest assessments, all with the ultimate goal of supporting policy and decision-making at international and national scales. Dr. Kapos is also a tropical forest ecologist, and she worked in Latin America and the Caribbean for many years, focusing on forest nutrient and water dynamics, as well as the effects of forest fragmentation. Today, Dr. Kapos will explain REDD+ safeguards for biodiversity and how they can be incorporated into REDD+ planning at the national level.
Right. It's about 9 o'clock at night for me. So I'm going to endeavor to keep both you and me awake and give you a really quick skate through what's going on with REDD more at the national level. Steve keeps doing the him and me thing. We did this by email before we got started, and so if it seems like we're beating it to death, it was really what we were trying to do to make sure we didn't both say the same thing. So what I'm going to try to cover is work that we've been doing within the UN REDD program on supporting REDD+ decisions at national scale. REDD+ officially is inherently a national mechanism, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the REDD+ context. I'll touch briefly on the safeguards as they're coming in under the UNFCCC, under the convention itself, and also within the UN REDD program. I'll introduce you to the UN REDD program because I think there's a little bit of confusion about what's what. And then I'm going to show you in a really fleeting flying tour some of the work that we've been doing with a whole series of different governments and government supporting agencies on mapping the potential for a wide range of environmental benefits, including biodiversity, from REDD+ interventions, a little bit of work on assessing costs and benefits, some of which is going to look remarkably like some of what David showed us, a bit about using scenarios, which Steve also mentioned, and a little bit, an alarmingly small amount, about monitoring and communicating the impacts of REDD+, because, as Steve showed, we're not really there yet, but we're thinking about it. So, REDD+ in context. You can't forget that part. This is all happening because of this white elephant, huge, slow, intergovernmental process that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's happening as slowly as it's happening because every single word is negotiated at length several times over. And people get the people who do the negotiating get very excited about it, and the rest of us yawn. But it is actually quite important, and it is what will determine what this looks like in the long run. And we mustn't forget it, because it's going to govern the things that we can do and the ways we can and can't work with governments, because it's going to govern what the governments are interested in. They're the ones that have the commitments under this convention. Also wanted to remind you, we've heard a lot about REDD and REDD+, and we've been bandying it about. I'm not allowed to bandy it about. REDD has morphed relatively recently from being reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So it went from being avoided deforestation, reducing emissions from deforestation, to, in Bali, including degradation, and then more recently, including the plus. The plus is not biodiversity benefits. Okay, this is a really, really common misconception. The plus is not the additional environmental benefits. The plus is these 3 additional activities, which recognize that different countries are in different places in terms of what they can do about their land use, their contributions to carbon emissions from land use change. So there's conservation of forest carbon stocks for countries that have lots of forest carbon and it's not under much threat. The president of Guyana was heard to say, we don't have a high deforestation rate, but it could be arranged. Okay, that's what conservation of forest carbon stocks is about. Sustainable management of forests for those countries for whom the revenues from their timber resources are vitally important, and for whom the entire country is a permanent forest estate in this extent, in the sense of forest management and exploitation. And enhancement of forest carbon stocks, where restoration is particularly important. Most countries will be doing a mixture of those activities, but when people talk about REDD+ activities, those are the 5 REDD+ activities. And the reason we're interested in this is that it's a lot of money. The stats, you can find any statistic you like, and notice that the word is pledged. Doesn't mean anybody's spending this, but it does mean that the government of Norway, the government of Germany, even the UK, and several of the multilateral funding organizations have all pledged money to support REDD+. At present, what they're spending money on is readiness activities. Steve mentioned this. It's all about getting governments ready to fly, helping them to think about what it is that they're going to need to do, what they expect to be doing on the ground, and what they need to be able to do to verify what they've done. And frankly, an awful lot of the work that's going on so far is actually measuring carbon. and getting people in place to do that, and getting their financial institutions up to speed. A lot of it's about governance. So, we've spent a lot of time talking about this today. I don't think I need to go into it in any detail. But Steve spent a lot of time saying, oh, well, the things we're doing for biodiversity generate carbon benefits. Most of your REDD audience is saying, I want a piece of that carbon pie. They're going into this from a carbon standpoint. And the case that we've been trying to make, the UN Environment Programme and the UN REDD Programme in general, has been trying to make countries think, governments think about the fact that they can actually get a lot more than carbon out of it. So we're actually thinking about this from the other way around. Not, of course we want to save biodiversity, but if you're going to save carbon, if you're going to hang on to carbon, you can get a lot more out of it if you choose how and where you do it. So we can think about biodiversity conservation. We've also talked about ecosystem services, climate regulation. Obviously, we're all in this for climate mitigation. Yes, people are interested in REDD finance, but actually the countries who are interested in REDD finance have an equally and probably a larger vested interest in making sure that climate change is mitigated. They're some of the countries that are most vulnerable. So there's a lot of enlightened self-interest in this. Some of it's financial, some of it's otherwise. We can go through the entire list of ecosystem function and service. You know, if somebody's done a study about it, somebody's thought about it in relation to REDD, I would say. But we mustn't also forget the social benefits. I won't say very much about the social benefits, and I'll explain a little bit more about why in a moment. But there are all sorts of things that are coming out of REDD. Some of it, again, is relatively speaking, improved well-being, financial well-being, more stable livelihoods, that sort of thing. But all sorts of things are coming out of the governance aspects of getting ready for REDD, including clarifying land tenure and rights to resources. There's a lot of discussion about, well, who's carbon? Who owns the carbon rights? So actually, there's quite a lot of both social and environmental progress that is potentially going to come out of this if it gets done right. But REDD also has risks. There are some potential interpretations, especially in the early discussions of REDD, that it might actually lead to replacing natural forests with plantation. The text of the REDD Plus decisions originally wasn't really very specific about that. It looks like we're going to miss that mostly if we pay attention to what has since been negotiated. And Steve mentioned leakage. This is a big one. And this is actually one of the main reasons that REDD Plus has to be, at some level, implemented or accountable at national scale. Because whatever you do at project scale, it's actually really hard to measure leakage. And it would be interesting if we could include some of that in our discussion later. Both carbon leakage and biodiversity leakage, and what anybody's actually managed to measure or not. And there are lots of risks, particularly social risks, around reducing access to resources. If you tell local people that they can't use the forest or they can't use the land that currently has forest on it, you are potentially reducing their access to resources that they depend on. There's the possibility for limited participation in decisions about local land use, poor governance, all the things that we know about. Now, these discussions have been going on for some time, and actually they've been going on in lots of different venues, and the convention itself has finally gotten around to recognizing those benefits and risks and has agreed to some safeguards. And they've actually been signed off. They were negotiated and they have been signed off. They were signed off in Cancun. So the countries who are party to the convention have agreed to, and this is interesting, they've agreed to promote and support them. Okay, they haven't agreed to report on them. There is no reporting. Okay, they've also potentially agreed to address and respect them. Okay?
Will the money actually flow if they don't?
The question, this is a really, really sensitive subject. The question of how you show that you have promoted and supported, and I'll come back to it in a minute. I just want to take a brief aside for a little morphing point. I used to be a field ecologist. Tara asked me how I got into policy, and the answer is kicking and screaming and dragged by the hair, and I can't believe I make comments about language in convention decisions. I'm not a lawyer, but the world is full of them. And people get really excited about the difference between promote and support and address and respect. It means something to an awful lot of people out there. So it is important to realize that. The formulation is necessarily general. These are safeguards that are supposed to apply to REDD as applied in all of the developing countries in the world. with all the different conditions that they have in terms of their forest resources, in terms of their economic dependencies or lack of them on forests, and the conditions of their local people and their other natural resources. Interestingly, in this world of negotiations, there is actually some concern that by adding the safeguards, we've actually broadened the remit of REDD still further, and it's making it that much harder to do it. Because the safeguards emphasize benefits as well as risks. They emphasize ensuring that you get the maximum benefit out of implementing REDD+, as well as ensuring that you do no harm. So the word safeguard sounds like do no harm. The text says all sorts of things about benefits as well as risks. This is a piece of the Cancun safeguard. It's not very much longer than this, actually. And I've tried to emphasize a couple of things that I think are important. So whatever you do to implement REDD+ needs to be consistent with the conservation of natural forests and biological diversity, that you mustn't use your REDD+ actions for the conversion of natural forests. You should use them to incentivize the protection and conservation of natural forests and their ecosystem services. This is really broad. And to enhance other social and environmental benefits. You can see why some people are worried, because that's a big mandate. That's a really, really broad thing. It's potentially quite encouraging, or it could be so broad that it doesn't actually mean very much. And depending on where you sit in a political spectrum, you either see that as scary, encouraging, or useless. Right, the UN REDD program. I said I wanted to set the record straight. So we have the Convention on Climate Change. That's what's negotiating about REDD+. That's what will develop the REDD mechanism. Mechanism is the word with respect to REDD+. The UN REDD program is a collaboration of 3 UN agencies. The UN Environment Programme, the United Nations Development Programme, which is the one that's handling most of the social benefits and risks, which is why I'm not going to talk about them very much, because they know much more about them than I do, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. And FAO's role, for those of you, Tara put up FAO statistics right at the beginning of the day. FAO is the source of all wisdom, sort of, on statistics on forest cover, and they've taken a strong role in what will be monitoring and verification at national level, or in supporting countries to get ready for that. So the UN REDD program supports nationally led REDD+ processes. It doesn't do project work. That was Steve, this is me. And it's working with 46 partner countries, but with a rather smaller number intensively, through direct support to implementation of national programs, readiness programs, building strategies, developing, and also on developing common approaches, methodologies and tools, which is a large part of what we've been up to. UNEP and its World Conservation Monitoring Center, which is me, are helping to support national REDD+ decision-making in 3 principal areas. One is in applying the REDD+ safeguards, and I've put brackets environmental because UNDP is doing the other bit. A big one for us, and the one I'll spend most time talking about, is assessment of what we call multiple benefits, the full range of environmental benefits from REDD+. And that's identifying, mapping, valuing, prioritizing. A lot of it's about just trying to make sure people think about them. And then coming on stream increasingly is the question of monitoring REDD+ impacts, monitoring safeguard implementation, and thinking about what safeguard information systems look like, where safeguard information systems are not monitoring, because that, for some reason, causes major allergies in international discussions. You may need to do some monitoring to be able to put some information into your safeguard information system, but that's not the same thing. So, applying safeguards. Again, it's early days with the safeguards, but because those safeguards are so general, it's very difficult for countries to know what to do about them. I mean, that paragraph was pretty characteristic of what's there. And so what the UN REDD program has done has spent some time parsing out. We're not allowed to interpret, but we are allowed to try to clarify or make suggestions about the operational implications of those safeguards. So we've developed what we call the Social and Environmental Principles and Criteria, the SEPC for short. And they've been developed as a guiding framework. They've been approved as a guiding framework, which means There's nothing compulsory about them. They're to help. They're basically to help countries think about what they need to do and to help the UN REDD program itself think about what principles and criteria it wants to live up to in what it funds and does. This is the health warning. You know, they're coherent with and they draw on what's in the safeguards proper. Here they are. Those are the principles. There are criteria under them. I am not expecting you to read all 7 of them, and I'm not going to read all 7 of them to you. But the first 3 are strictly social. The last 3 are strictly environmental. The one in the middle is about sustainable development, so it's arguably both social and environmental. And it's also all about the fact that countries are committed to a lot of environmental agreements. The Convention on Biological Diversity, CITES, World Heritage Convention, the Convention on Desertification. The same countries that have signed up to this, to climate change, signed up to the other Rio Conventions and a lot more besides. And it's about actually trying to make sure that what happens in REDD preferably supports those commitments or certainly doesn't conflict with them. So I've grayed out the social ones because I'm not going to talk about them at all, and I'm not going to talk about these in detail, but I just wanted to give you one little piece of flavor about actually how some of these safeguards are challenging. I'm going to focus on Principle 5, which is the one that says protect natural forest from degradation and or conversion. Oops, I've got this slightly out of order. We've also developed a question-based tool to help countries think still deeper than these criteria and to help them think about what information they would need to know whether they were conforming or supporting these criteria. Here's Principle 5. We produced 3 criteria under this one. It's all about what you're doing for REDD. It's not about what's happening in your country at large. It's about what you're doing and claiming as part of your REDD program. Again, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but there's a bit which is about conversion, a bit which is about degradation, and a bit, quite importantly, which is about indirect land use change. And this is something the UN REDD program did advisedly. Indirect land use change is not specifically mentioned. But we thought it was actually quite important as we thought through the implications of the safeguards to try to point out that if you're talking about hanging on to natural forest, you need to think about the 3 ways in which REDD activities could potentially affect it. You'd like to think no REDD activity would ever have a negative impact on natural forest. But there's a really critical issue in here. What is a natural forest? Anybody have an answer to that? This came back from Tanzania last week. I have colleagues working with Tanzanians to think about the information implications of safeguards within their country. Most countries do not have a national definition of natural forest. There is no UNFCCC definition of natural forest. These are 3 different ways that you could see natural forest in Tanzania. Tanzania has a recent land use and land cover map, which has a whole series of types of forest. But Tanzania is the Miombo, so quite a lot of its natural vegetation is referred to as woodland, not as forest. The only 2 things that are referred to as natural forest on the National Land Use and Land Cover Map are montane and lowland forest. There it is. So all those little green bits. Okay, if those are the bits that they're not supposed to prejudice with their REDD activities, it's a relatively straightforward job, I would argue. Some of those are in protected areas, some of them aren't. Then we have an FAO definition. This is most of what goes into the statistics that Tara showed. This is what countries report to FAO, and it gets a little bit sort of harmonized to make sure that everybody's really using the same definition. And if we use that, that's what might be considered to be natural forest. So it's made up of, it's naturally regenerated, it's of natural origin, so nobody's planted it, and it's got roughly those dimensions, and it includes those broad categories. And if you actually start thinking about most of the woody vegetation of Tanzania, you have to go down to 2 meters, and you have to start talking about what in Tanzania is called bushland and thicket. Now, how is it that Tanzania is supposed to decide that it's meeting the safeguard? How is it that it's supposed to convince anybody else that it's meeting the safeguard? And how is it that what it says is going to be the same or different from what Kenya says or what Indonesia says? So we're not there yet. Okay, End of safeguard rant. I could rant that way about most of it, but yeah, there are interesting bits, there are challenges. It's really encouraging that it's there, because it will imply an obligation on countries to at least think about the issues and show something about what they're doing. But there's a lot to be sorted out yet, and that's one of the reasons this stuff is moving so slowly. Now, just thinking a little bit about mapping the potential for environmental benefits. Maps are not the answer to everything, but they're an awfully good way to make people think. We find them very helpful. We find them helpful because making decisions about land use is very complex, whether it's for REDD or whether it's for anything else. There are multiple demands on land, and those present huge challenges for REDD plus planning. And at national level, there has to be planning. I mean, you may not have a centrally planned economy, but you still have to do some planning if you're actually going to make a national claim. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are unevenly distributed. Overlaying maps is quite helpful. And as I say, it makes people sit up and pay attention. This is all the other reasons that maps are important. Sorry, some of this is a bit duplicative. We've done a whole series of things, and we've used a whole series of sources. With each country we work with, we end up using different sources of information. Sometimes they're regional and global sources. Sometimes they're national sources. It depends on where the country is. A lot of this is about getting something on the table. Partly because if you get something on the table, then people can tell you it's wrong, and you can make it better. If you don't have anything on the table, you just wander around and go, we haven't got any information. So I spend an awful lot of time going, yes, I know these are lousy data, but they're all there is. Tell me there's something better. Give it to me. Let's put it on the map. We do an awful lot of putting things on tables and getting people to draw circles. So this was a very early, very top-down analysis for Nigeria, in which we took a global data set on biomass carbon and soil carbon, and we combined it with information. Anybody know what an IBA is?
Important bird area?
Well done. I knew you guys would know. Okay. But we also combined it with some very relative, well, these are quite coarse. We have much more detailed range data for great apes, but great apes are really quite sexy, and everybody in Africa has signed up to the Kinshasa Accord. I was talking about international obligations. All the countries in Africa have signed up to the Kinshasa Accord, which means they are legally obliged to look after their great apes. Which means that you'd like to think their REDD activities would help them do that, and they certainly shouldn't get in the way. So this was just, it helps people think, well, where am I thinking about conserving carbon stocks, although stocks aren't really the answer. What's really the answer is stock at risk. We're not there yet with Nigeria. And where can we put that together with what we know about biodiversity priorities in one way or another? We can do this in lots of different ways. We've done it in lots of different ways with lots of different countries. It's all very high level, quite coarse. It's not what you get out of your plots on the ground or your mistnets, although a lot of it does derive originally from that sort of field data. You can also produce some incredibly ugly maps. But different things ring different people's bells. And one of the things that we often end up doing is showing things in different ways. This is using all of the IUCN mammal, bird, and amphibian distribution data. So full assessment, all of those three taxa, overlaid individual species distributions. Doesn't mean they're there. It's extent of occurrence, not area of occupancy. On top of a carbon map. If you were really going to prioritize REDD for biodiversity, you'd be looking for the ugly little brown bits. The pink bits and the green bits aren't so interesting, and I hate this map, but it's one way of showing things. And it's one way of getting an awful lot of information into a single map. For some people, it floats their boat. For other people, they look at it and they go, well, pink and green's really lousy anyway, but it may or may not be helpful. This is another way of looking at things. Here we have essentially the same carbon data, but we've got something synthesized. This is important bird areas and a couple of other areas which are key biodiversity areas. Key biodiversity areas are the attempt to expand important bird areas to include other taxa. So it's applying internationally agreed criteria, theoretically through national experts, to identify priority areas for conservation. It's one system. There are umpteen systems. Some countries have their own. Some countries have their own national biodiversity strategies. Others are down to these international priorities. It's another way of visualizing. It's a way of saying, well, look, if I really wanted to, if I wanted to invest in REDD activities, I might actually want to focus on some of these areas that are important for biodiversity as well as for carbon. Putting it on the table. But it's more than just biodiversity, and it's more than just carbon. Depending on who you are and where you are, you do actually have to think about maintaining access to forest resources for some of you people, and you do have to think about particular kinds of ecosystem services. We've spent a little bit of time with some countries looking at areas where the forest plays a particularly important role in controlling erosion or sedimentation. If you're in Panama, the most important thing in your universe is making sure that the water supply for the canal is high and the dredging bill for the canal is low. The red bit up at the top there is the catchment for the canal. So basically what this is steep slopes combined with high rainfall, combined with important catchments. It's a way of thinking about it. We could put carbon under it, but then it would be a really messy map. In Tanzania, non-timber forest products are the National Forest Department in Tanzania is the Department of Forestry and Beekeeping. That is actually its designation. Okay? And it has a zoning plan. This doesn't mean there are beehives all over the yellow area, or that there's gum production all over the purple area. It's that these are areas that have been zoned in the country as being priorities for that. That's useful information in terms of thinking about what kinds of activities you might want to carry out. We spent some time with the tourism master plan for Panama and pulled out the bits of it that have been designated. They're actually administrative units. The dots are sites. The areas are administrative units associated with the sites. Thinking about where's been zoned for adventure tourism and ecotourism. Doesn't mean there are installations there, but that's a place where you might actually be wanting to make the case that a REDD intervention would maintain the potential for that tourism income, even if the tourism income isn't there yet. Option values, good things. You also want to be able to put things in context. And we do eventually want to be aspiring to not be doing these maps with carbon stock, but to be doing them with carbon at risk. That requires potentially varying degrees of sophisticated land use modeling or not so sophisticated land use modeling. This is really not sophisticated. This shows recent deforestation with a buffer around it, but I can't remember how big the buffer is, and it doesn't say. But again, this provides some context for Ecuador. Should have labeled the country, but anyway, most of you can recognize that. So the point here is building a visual story and help giving people something that they can sit down and play with. We have actually in the past done some of this, not on a GIS, but actually given people acetates. Remember acetates? Overhead projector sheets? You can shuffle them, and you don't actually have to be able to drive a GIS. And you don't need internet access. And you can jump up and down and scream about it at a table, and you can get really heated. And people find that quite helpful sometimes. Sometimes it just makes for arguments. This is really bad cartography, and I'm probably not even allowed to show this. But I'm showing it to make a point. This is, recognize the country? Who knows which country it is? Does it say? It does say Cambodia. Never mind. Forget it. Sorry. There's usually the quick question, because out of context, it's a funny shape, and people don't really recognize it. When we did some work with Cambodia, they wanted to know about the amount of carbon that was under the control of different ministries, which is actually in itself kind of interesting. And these are all official designation for lands. And we have protected areas, which we all know what protected areas are, which overlap very nicely with economic land concessions, the occasional forest concession. Actually, turns out there's some carbon stocks controlled by the ministry, by whichever department it is for fisheries.
What's an economic land concession?
It's I'm not being a Cambodian lawyer, don't quote me on this, but in the same way that a forest concession is land that has been designated to be potentially exploitable, an economic land concession, I think, is essentially a concession open for land use and potentially conversion.
So, but anything?
It's a piece of land that the government is prepared to give out a license on. If it were a mining concession, it would be giving out mining rights. If it's an economic land concession, it's land that is potentially biddable on for economic use. Okay, but as I said, I'm not sure this is classified, but I'm fairly positive it's also not valid anymore. And it's a really ugly map. We called this one the Tutti Frutti map for a while. But the point is there are lots of different stakeholders involved in this, even within that one government that we're supposed to be dealing with. And the finance for REDD, this is something I meant to say earlier when I was talking about the REDD context. When we're talking about REDD money coming into a country, it is not coming to the Environment Ministry, mostly. The people who are in the room negotiating about REDD are mostly not from the Environment Ministry. They are from the Office of Climate Change, which is often sitting in the Treasury. Occasionally it's sitting in the Environment Ministry, but often it's sitting in the Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Finance or whatever the equivalent thing is. They are not people who think biodiversity first. And that's actually the way I'm saying, what else can you get out of this? Because this is coming at it from the other end. This is coming at it from, okay, I'm not a conservationist. I am, but if they're not conservationists, what is it that's going to catch their interest? And what do they have to take account of as they start to plan? And one of the things they have to take account of is that there are lots and lots of different interests in the other ministries, and they really need to be talking to each other. And in many cases, they're not at all. We can also think about ways of trying to build a rationale for this is going to build. Don't worry too much about how you might plan to do particular kinds of things. So, I had a colleague who was working with a bit of the Indonesian Forest Department to think about how and where in Central Sulawesi you might want to prioritize for forest rehabilitation. And we said, well, in the first instance, you can't restore forest that's primary forest because it's still there. You probably can't rehabilitate forest where you've got active forestry plantations or where you have settlements or where you have productive agricultural land. Those lands are not available. You do want to do it where you've got low carbon stock. So at the moment we have a map which is displaying information on carbon stocks in areas that are not primary forest, settlements, plantations. Agricultural areas are hatched and low carbon areas are highlighted in pink. There's a designation called critical land, which is land in Indonesia that is seen as of vital importance for something, usually something environmental, but not always. So it's usually steep slopes. So that would be a high priority for doing some restoration. And if you put all that together, as ugly as it was to start with, you can end up with something which gives you a slightly more explicit rationale for areas that might be used for rehabilitation. It's a way to build it. It's not completely the answer. One of the interesting things I flagged over lunch, I flagged the fact that Indonesia in 2006 changed its definition of primary forest. And the amount of primary forest it had went down by, I can't remember whether it was 30 or 50% overnight. And it's not because they cleared a bunch of forest. It's because you can't convert primary forest and you can convert secondary forest. Right. If all this is coming in through the finance ministry, do they really think in terms of tons of carbon and hectares of forest and cubic meters of timber? No, they tend to think in terms of money, or at least in terms of contributions to the economy. And I am not an economist. I have been thoroughly indoctrinated by one, and therefore I'm going to make a strong distinction between monetary value and economic value. Okay, we can talk about something's contribution to the economy, to the economic well-being of a country without actually putting dollars and cents on it. And for most of us are a lot more comfortable with that than with saying that this particular high biodiversity, high conservation value area is worth X. So decisions about land use do depend on economic information. We want to try to understand the variation in costs and the combinations of benefits across space and over time, and spatial analysis under different future scenarios is also important. So this was the tame economist I had last year, and this is how he saw things fitting together. I think it's a reasonable way. If we think about the values of the benefits, where they might not be monetary, if we think about the costs of achieving different kinds of benefits, if we think about the fact that those things vary in space, and we think about the fact that we do actually need to think about this over time. We can't be thinking about it now. We have to be thinking about it in probably at least a 30-year time horizon. The main components to costs are opportunity costs. This is what David described so brilliantly without actually using the word. These are the foregone benefits from using the land for something else. And you talked about it in terms of logging and oil palm. If you're in Brazil, it's soy and sugarcane or cattle ranching. If you're in Central Africa, it's probably timber again. Implementation costs we know very little about at the moment. We know a bit about costs of managing protected areas. We know a bit about something. We know something about restoration costs. It would be very interesting to get out of some of those voluntary market projects, really what it's cost them to get them up and running, because I think there isn't enough on the table about that. And and that's kind of the elephant in the room, because opportunity cost, you're not necessarily spending. You don't necessarily have to compensate all of that. But if it's going to cost you something to hang on to a particular area of forest and you have to spend that, that's cash, and people are worried about that. And then there are transaction costs, and those are going up as I speak, because the transaction costs are everything that's about putting the systems in place, making the accountability correct, making sure the financial systems are working, all of that. And as I say, they're getting big. Every time there's a UNFCCC meeting, the transaction costs have gone up hugely, so they're going to go up next month again.
That's system cost you're talking
System.
about, not the project transaction.
I'm talking, well, system and project, but I'm not doing project. I'm talking purely system, really. You would need to add project on top of that. We're asking these questions about costs, but one of the interesting questions for me is, does it cost any more to get these extra benefits that we're talking about? And we don't really know about that. Are the opportunity costs of areas that are important for biodiversity higher than the opportunity costs of similar carbon stocks that are somewhere else? And again, that's something that mostly hasn't been done. Oscar Venter's done a bit of that, showing that the opportunity, well, he didn't though. He didn't compare it with another subset. He just said the costs aren't that high. So it's about trying to identify cost-effective solutions to attain multiple goals. It's about trying to identify economic trade-offs. If it's going to cost me more to do this over here, but I get these extra economic benefits, in our group, we're trying to stay very far away from cost-benefit analysis in dollars and cents, but trying somehow to get at those trade-offs and to understand the overall economic importance of different things that you might do for REDD. You can go about estimating the economic values of carbon benefits. You can play around with market carbon prices. That's, at the moment, we don't really know what the magnitude of the benefits that are going to come in under the official REDD mechanism are going to be. We can think about market-based benefits for some of the other things, so about timber, oil palm, non-timber forest, oil palm, that's opportunity cost, but sustainable timber. We can think about what that brings in on the market. We can think about non-timber forest product harvest or ecotourism income, but there's all this other stuff which isn't marketed, and economists have a lot harder time with that. And that's where we may need to start thinking about things not in dollars and cents. If it goes to market, you can do it in dollars and cents. If it doesn't go to market, it's much harder. And depending on what kind of an economist you are, your comfort zone is in one place or another with respect to that. But these are all the things that are having to go into these discussions. Here's my blurb about monetary versus non-monetary. Monetary is easy, people understand it. It's a really good argument to put on the table, but it's got some seriously conceptual limitations, and it's technically very challenging because you have to mess around with discount rates and all the things that Brendan Fisher does that I don't understand. Non-monetary valuation can be a practical alternative. It can involve qualitative scaling or other sorts of things that give you a sense of relative value. But then you end up stuck in multi-criterion analysis. We've been starting to play with this for REDD planning. Don't worry about the details. Don't worry about the fact that the entire Democratic Republic of Congo is red. But we have been playing with multi-criterion analysis techniques where we are taking carbon, biodiversity, and other ecosystem service values into account. And the idea here is that you sit with decision makers and get them to talk about what their priorities are, and then you do a multi-criterion analysis that takes account of that and of some estimate of cost, where cost, we often use just area as a proxy for cost in the first instance, which is a lousy proxy. But this is very, very early stages. Marxan is probably not the answer. It's just the one that was easily available off the shelf and was written up in all the conservation literature. There are lots of other things, and it's early days. But again, things that help people visualize the effects of different kinds of decisions are really very helpful. And actually, a really effective thing is to give people a little paper Marxan exercise and make them do the solution themselves. It's really interesting. They really like that. We have one on the shelf that we take into a workshop before we actually start doing something bigger, and they love it. You know, you give them 10 minutes to get the best solution to a sort of 5x5 grid. And it really makes people think. But there are other ways of looking, you know, of giving people criterion ways to think about. We were asked, this was a long time ago, to provide some sort of guidance for approaches to restoration and rehabilitation, how that related to ecosystem services. And different, as I said, about maps, it's true about other kinds of tools. You know, some people, I've got a colleague who just thinks something like the Marxan analysis is the best thing since sliced bread. And lots of people don't understand it, and they have no idea what this black box is spitting at them. But they can understand something like this, which is a scorecard, which says, well, you know, this thing's really expensive, but this one has really easy to measure carbon benefits, and they're more or less important for all these different ecosystem service benefits. So, you know, there are ways and ways of giving people the basis for starting to make decisions. Scenarios. Lots of people understand different things by scenarios. In my world, in the first instance, a scenario is a story. It's a plausible future. And it may or may not be parameterized. It may or may not exactly have numbers associated with it. And it doesn't have mapped land use associated with it, land use change associated with it, until you've actually gone through a modeling exercise, which is another and much more painful step. But there's a reason for wanting to work out a series of possible futures. One of them is what Steve referred to, which is thinking about your reference emission levels and what would happen to that forest if you didn't do something to change the future. But there's a range of possible futures. And so you want to look at the reference emission levels and the possible outcomes in emissions and biodiversity and ecosystem service terms in REDD futures versus non-REDD futures, but also potentially in different kinds of REDD futures. There's biodiversity-friendly REDD, where you actually prioritize, you know, we can prioritize doing certain kinds of REDD actions in areas of high biodiversity importance. We can go for spending our REDD resources in areas of high biodiversity importance first, or we can go for the carbon first, or we can come up with a whole series of different solutions. That's scenario building, and we can start to think about what that looks like. They're fundamentally participatory, and they are not predictions. They're what-ifs. And that's a really hard thing to get through people's heads. The IPCC has got us forwards with what scenarios are, but people still think they're predictions. And they're not. The models make the predictions, and even those aren't right. So the things that go into a scenario analysis include policy narratives. So how might you implement it? What other policies are on the table? What are the things that are already, what are you committed to? We have a national target of exporting this much timber for the next 20 years. You know, if the Commerce Ministry has that as a target, and the Transport Ministry has the fact that we're going to build another 40 kilometers or 400 kilometers of paved roads, and the Agriculture Department has a palm oil production target, chances are they don't add up anyway. But you really need to get those people around a table to look at that and recognize it, and that's what national plans are built of when they're done properly. You can use models to start to take into account what we know about international demand and economic factors, different international contexts like carbon prices. So you can say, you know, what's going to happen if REDD's delivering more money or less money. And we can start to use models, land use models based on scenarios, to look at the potential impacts of land use and land cover change on biodiversity. And we can do that in simplistic ways and much more complicated ways. I think we'll skip that. This is sort of a rehash of that, but it's actually thinking about modeling rather than just scenarios. And the fact that if we want to talk about REDD as something that's going to deliver on biodiversity conservation, we need to get biodiversity conservation into the models that are delivering some of these scenarios. I've been working with one particular land use modeling group just to try to make sure that they handle protected areas in a realistic way. Most land use modelers handle protected areas by saying, it's protected, it's out of the model. And depending on where you are, if you're in Central Africa, that's possibly, if you're in Central Africa, if it's actually a forest concession, it's probably safer than if it's a protected area, because it's permanent forest estate and it must remain forest. If it's a protected area, it's a little iffier. So trying to get the modelers to take better account of the conservation units we're managing already, thinking about the ways that we can report on biodiversity impacts. And I mean, Steve referred to this in terms of monitoring, but we're looking at some of the same things: land use change in priority areas, or particular species ranges, or loss of habitat, or change in landscape function. They're all the sorts of things you would monitor, but you'd like to be able to try to get those things out of a land use model. And then playing with actually how and where you target REDD. And finally, monitoring. I'm going to skate through this very quickly. We need to monitor because we need to be able to assess the effectiveness of management actions, to assess whether we're actually achieving all these benefits that we're aspiring to. But we can't monitor everything. And there are endless number of monitoring plans out there that are so completely unrealistic, so we need to prioritize. UNFCCC requires information on how safeguards are addressed and respected to be provided periodically. But it doesn't actually say you have to monitor. I'm not quite sure where the information is supposed to come from. It's a sort of funny little conundrum. So there is monitoring. This is very funny convention speak to make sure that we're not telling countries they have to monitor. Monitoring is actually really useful for thinking about, this came out of something that came out late last year. There was a global forest expert panel report which looked at, among other things, the management impacts of certain kinds of REDD interventions, basically based on literature review. And one of the things we did, we had this expert panel, and we all went, well, what's REDD? What are people doing under REDD? And so the first thing we had to do was come up with a list of things you might be doing to achieve REDD objectives, and then think how they related to REDD activities. And basically, you might do any number of things. You might implement reduced impact logging, for example, either to reduce emissions from forest degradation, or you might be reporting that under sustainable management of forests. Similarly, pretty much everything maps against several REDD activities. For any of those things, we don't know enough about their impacts. Even on carbon, much less on biodiversity. We need to get better at that, and monitoring is the only way we're going to do it. Management impacts are highly variable. They depend on lots of things that people haven't even really thought about thoroughly. And not all impacts are easily anticipated or measured. So we know something about displaced pressures. I do want to have a discussion later about how you measure them. There are downstream impacts on aquatic systems of doing certain kinds of things that people hadn't even begun to think about. But for example, where you're trying to improve agricultural productivity to reduce pressure on forests, there's a reasonable chance you're trashing your aquatic systems, depending on how you do that. So there are an awful lot of careful thinking that needs to happen to identify monitoring priorities. And both the magnitude and the direction of impacts can change over time. And David was talking about extinction debts. Some impacts occur very, very slowly. And that's very hard to get through people's heads. The time frames for your monitoring, and the time frame for your action may not be the same. And finally, it's important in the context of the safeguards to realize that quite a lot of the monitoring that's going to go on is going to be what one of my colleagues calls process monitoring, which is saying, yep, we did it. Not, yep, it had an effect, but yep, we did it. You know, we have a law that says this. We have a regulation that says that. We have a 5-yearly review process. It's probably better than not doing it. Yeah, because you have to ask yourself those questions. But it's not sufficient. Both process and impact monitoring can help to support adaptive management. You know, if you're having a really hard time getting that law through, then maybe you need a different law, or you need to be aiming to tackle the problem a different way. And so trying to get through the idea that monitoring is about feedback into what you're doing, and that plans are not supposed to be set in stone is another key part of this, in my opinion. This is an opinion. Let's leave that, except to say that choosing monitoring priorities is a lot about national policy priorities. So I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to come back to one more thing, which is the message for what I think is a mixed audience of people who are sciencey and people who are a bit more policy-y. It's something that actually comes out of more than REDD. So REDD plus decisions at national level are complex. I mean, it's bad enough at project scale. But at national scale, it's really messy because you are trying to balance all those different national priorities, often without involving the practitioners in all those different fields. And so trying to get some level of integrated land use planning going and getting all those people around a table is a good ambition. How easy it's going to prove to be is going to vary from between countries. Taking account of risks and benefits can actually strengthen the case for REDD action. David showed us that actually carbon money, payments for ecosystem service type money, are not likely to balance the opportunity costs. But if you can actually make the case for the economic values of those additional benefits, they help to make the case for REDD. You don't make it on a financial basis. You don't make it on we're going to get this much per ton and therefore we're going to get this much cash coming in. You make it on the basis of we're going to get this much cash coming in and we still get all these things that we get by hanging on to our forests. If we can get that through, which is in some places the green economy language, we will get farther in some countries. Spatial information, economic analyses, scenarios and modeling can all help with this, to explore synergies and trade-offs, and to present clearly, or at least a little bit more clearly, what REDD can deliver. Not necessarily what it will deliver, but what it can deliver. We need more evidence, and a lot of that's going to come out of monitoring, and it's going to come out of pulling stuff out of the scientific literature into forms that people can understand. Sorry, but and we're going to need to address very explicitly the safeguards that are in place, including the ones in the voluntary sector, which are quite helpful in a sort of in an operational sense. And we're doing quite a lot of looking at the parallels. And we really need effective communication, which brings me to my last point. I flew in from London yesterday. I don't know how many people have been on the Underground in London, but you hear mind the gap all the time. It is actually the gap between the train and the platform, but the gap I have in mind is the gap between the scientists out there digging holes and getting fish out of stream. And that's a soil pit. They're measuring soil carbon. It's a singularly unrewarding activity. That's a UNFCCC meeting. Okay? We need to get better about bridging the gap between what we know as field scientists and other kinds of scientists and what they're trying to make decisions about. And this is actually something this slide is something that came out of a talk I gave to the British Ecological Society's Forest Ecology Group a while ago, which was about saying that we need to be clearer about language and definitions and realize that what we call something isn't necessarily what's on the table. Take the natural forest question. It's not always clear. So we need to at least be clear about what we mean. It's not that there's ever going to be a standard definition, but if you can be explicit about what you mean, that's very helpful. You need to provide context. Where you think your work is policy relevant, then draw the linkages. The journal editors might throw it out. The reviewers almost certainly will, but try. Because then somebody will pick it up and put it in their review for policymakers. You know, that little paragraph at the end that says this might be significant because is useful because people like me get a hold of it. Provide reviews and synthesis and options, including in less academic forms. You may not get a thrill out of writing non-peer-reviewed papers, but actually, I'll tell you something, those guys never read peer-reviewed papers. So you need either to be producing stuff that, policy briefs and things that aren't quite those peer-reviewed papers, or you need to be engaging with boundary organizations like WCMC or others that basically form that interface between science and policy, and helping them to get the right end of what it is that you've published and get it across in forms that are understandable outside of the technical sphere. You also need to be aware of political agendas. There are a lot of them out there, and ecologists in particular are often not very good about that. You also need to be aware of sovereignty and sensitivities. If you work in country, you know about this, but there are an amazing number of people who write papers that say, I think Brazil should, the conclusion from my research shows clearly that Brazil needs to do this. It's not a good way to get uptake of your messages. And it's a shame, but it's true. And there are lots of hidden agendas. And this is my big one. Minimize, as a scientist, minimize the frequency with which you say, it's terribly, terribly complicated. Can't possibly give you an answer. It's all far too complex. You have to say it. I still say it all the time. But the number of times I've been asked for one single set of conservation priorities, just tell us where to do it. There has to be an answer. There isn't an answer. We know there isn't an answer, but there are ways and ways of getting that multiplicity of answers across. And saying, oh God, it's too hard, is not the best way to do it. Right, and because I was told I needed to make sure I had messages for policymakers, for those of you who are in the room, we'd like to think that policymakers would increasingly consult scientists before setting targets and policy. It would have been really nice if somebody had asked a scientist before that 2010 biodiversity target went out. I mean, we know it's aspirational, but boy, completely unmeasurable. Open communication channels from the policy end. I mean, it's all very well for us to be sitting in academia saying, you need to listen to us. But to the extent that policymakers are increasingly opening those communication channels, it helps. The IPCC has done all of us a big favor by educating the policy world on what uncertainty is. The policy world needs to meet us part way and accept. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this particularly in this country, but uncertainty is there, and we need to get a whole lot better as a policy community at understanding and accepting, or trying to understand and trying to recognize that it's part of life. And anticipate, plan for, and accept advances in understanding. If we didn't get better at understanding this stuff, if our ideas didn't change, we'd be missing a few tricks. And again, that's partly up to us as scientists trying to continue to educate our audience, but one would like to think that the policy community was getting better at listening, continuing to listen and to ask questions despite complexity. And I'm done.